Assalamu alaikum. Today we're going to start with the chapter of experimental chemistry, and I divided it into 5 learning outcomes for your ease: experimental design, methods of purification, methods of analysis, identification of ions, and identification of gases. So first we have experimental design, which says that we have to firstly name appropriate apparatus for different types of values, and we also should know how to suggest suitable apparatus. Okay, so let's see. How are we going to go about that? We have first the methods of purification and analysis, and these are all the learning outcomes for that. Let's start. So, measurements. What does a study of chemistry require? It requires the measurement of various quantities. For example, mass, volume, time, temperature, etc. So for mass, we use a beam balance or an electronic balance. Okay, these are the two apparatus used to measure mass. And then we have time. For time, we use a stopwatch or a stop clock to measure it. Then next we have temperature. This over here, we all know this is an electrical thermometer, and this is a data logger. Apart from that, alcohol in glass thermometers and mercury in glass thermometers are also used. These are those typical thermometers that are not electrical. They have mercury in them, and that mercury or alcohol expands and rises according to the temperature difference. We have volume next. So what are the different apparatus for volumes? We have a beaker for measuring approximate values. Then we have a measuring cylinder for measuring it to 1 centimeter cube. Then we have a burette for 0.1 centimeter cube measurements. Then we have a pipette for exact measurements, like you can have a pipette for 25 centimeter cube. And this over here is a gas syringe. Okay, and this over here is a liquid syringe. So these are also used to measure volume. Okay, then we have the methods of purification and all the learning outcomes that we're going to discuss. So in methods of purification, what is a pure substance? A pure substance just has one atom or one molecule, okay? And a mixture is one or more of these pure substances combined together. And how can they be separated? How can a mixture be separated? Using different methods of purification. Now, one thing we need to understand about purities and impurities: if I add any impurity to a substance, for example, any impurity would be something that is not the substance. Like if I add water to alcohol, so water becomes the impurity because I'm adding it to alcohol, and then alcohol is no longer purely alcohol. So firstly, if I just had alcohol, that was my pure substance, but when I added water to it, it became impure because in impurity, water was added to it. And whenever I'm going to add any impurity to any substance, the melting point decreases. Always remember that whenever any impurity is added, the melting point is lowered, and you have a range of melting points. For example, if you add an impurity to water like sand, so what is the melting point for water? The melting point is 0 degrees Celsius. That is going to be lower to say -5 degrees Celsius or anything. And you will have a range of melting points. So first you just had exact 0 degrees Celsius as your melting point, but now you have several different values for your melting point. Okay, then what is the first method to separate two substances? You have dissolving, filtration, then evaporation. That's one method, and these are the 3 steps for it. You first dissolve, then you filter it, and then you evaporate the substance. Okay, so when do you do that? When you have both soluble and insoluble substances dissolved in a particular liquid. Okay, for example, I have salt, sand, and the 2 of them are dissolved in water. Now we all know that salt is going to dissolve in water completely, but sand is not going to dissolve in water because it's insoluble, so it becomes a sediment. So if I want to filter it, what is going to happen? If I'm going to filter this whole mixture of salt and sand, what happens? This is the filter paper. When I pour my mixture over here, the sand is going to collect as a residue in the filter paper, and all the water plus salt is going to drop slowly into the flask. Over here, they've given you the diagram for chalk and water. So chalk is suspended as a sediment in water as it's insoluble. When you filter it, the chalk collects over here as the residue, and all the water drops down through the funnel, and it's called the filtrate. So whatever is left in the filter paper is known as your residue, and whatever comes out is called your filtrate. Okay, now next, when you've done that, when you've separated sand, okay, you got sand in the filter paper, Sand has been separated, and now what mixture are you left with? You're left with a mixture of salt and water. Now, in this mixture of salt and water, it's completely dissolved. So you can't physically separate salt and water like you could physically separate sand and the salty water. So what do? You evaporate it. Here you have this china dish or any evaporating dish, and you put it on your Bunsen burner. This is your Bunsen burner. And when you evaporate it, you're going to get these salt crystals. This is called evaporation till crystallization. This type of evaporation is known as evaporation till crystallization, when you evaporate it to an extent that some water is left. Some of the water in solution form is left. So you do not completely evaporate it that it's completely dry. You leave some of the water in it, and so crystals of salt are going to be formed. But if you evaporate it until dryness, so what happens? You completely evaporate it till no water is left at all. There is no water in your solution. It's completely dry, and so you're going to get that salt in that form. For example, I am evaporating copper. If the question asks me to explain a method to obtain copper sulfate crystals. Now, if I want crystals, then I'm going to evaporate it till crystallization. It's very easy. For crystals, you evaporate it till crystallization. And if you want pure dry samples of copper sulfate, then you're going to evaporate it till dryness. It depends on what the question tells you. What's the difference between copper sulfate crystals and dried copper sulfate sample? What's the difference between copper sulfate that has been evaporated till crystallization and copper sulfate that has been evaporated till dryness? There is a difference. So in evaporation till crystallization, you have crystals formed and it has water in it. So you can see that the formula tells us that this contains water of crystallization. What is that water called that we leave over here? It's called water of crystallization. And so this water of crystallization is written as 0.5 H2O for copper. So that's known as pentahydrate because there are 5 molecules of water of crystallization in copper sulfate. So you write it as copper sulfate 0.5 H2O, which makes it copper sulfate pentahydrate or hydrated copper sulfate. Hydrated means hydration. It comes from the word hydration, and we know that we associate the term hydration to water. So in a hydrated salt or hydrated copper sulfate means that it has water of crystallization. But if I'm talking about the anhydrous salt that has been dried, that has been evaporated till dryness, so then it's going to form a white powder. Over here we had blue crystals, and over here we're going to have a dry blue powder that has no water of crystallization, so you'll simply write it as copper sulfate. That is the difference. And if you're going to heat your copper sulfate crystals further, it's going to form anhydrous salt, because then this water of crystallization is going to evaporate. Okay, then the next method for separation or purification is decanting. What does decanting mean? Decanting means you gradually pour the liquid from one container to another. Now, how do you do that? All of you must have at least tried this method out at home. For example, when you're pouring tea and you don't have the sieve, you carefully just pour out the tea and you leave all the impurities, the sediments behind. All of you must have carefully poured a mixture that has sediments at the bottom in a manner that only the liquid comes into the beaker. So to even make that even more accurate, you have this wooden stick, and so that helps you out when you're pouring it. It helps you uniformly pour your water, leaving the sediments behind. And then you have centrifugation. What is centrifugation? That is when you are separating particles with speed. So this is that apparatus you're going to use for centrifugation, and you're going to have this test tube here. It has sediments, as you can see, and when you rotate that at very high speed, what happens is that the sediments settle at the bottom in the form of a pellet. So first the particles were suspended, and then they settled down in the form of a pellet. That is centrifugation, is a technique to separate particles from a solution with the help of speed. And then now I have the separating technique for immiscible liquids. I use a separating funnel. Immiscible liquids, what does the term immiscible mean? It means they do not mix. The two liquids do not mix. We have the most famous example of oil and water. Okay, so what happens? You have the separating funnel, and in the separating funnel, you have a tap over here. You first let your oil and your water sit, and when you let it sit, so the less denser liquid will collect at the bottom. Here water was less dense, so it collected at the bottom, and you're going to let the denser liquid then come over to the top. And when you leave it for a long time, this is how it's going to collect water at the bottom, or the less denser liquid at the bottom, and the more denser liquid, the denser liquid, oil at the top. And so when the tap is opened, you can collect water easily in a separate beaker, and you can then stop the tap, and then you can collect oil in a separate beaker. That's very easy. That's the method you use for separating immiscible liquids to liquids that do not mix. Now, then you have sublimation. Sublimation is the process for only subliming substances. What are subliming substances? Subliming substances are those that change directly from solid to gas without the process of them changing into a liquid in between. What are examples of subliming substances? We have a very famous example, iodine. We have naphtha, we have dry ice, which is a very famous example. So these examples are those of subliming substances, and through sublimation we can separate them from any mixture. So say I have iodine and some other crystals or some any other impurity that does not sublime, and I know that it contains iodine which can sublime. So I'm going to set up this kind of an apparatus where I am going to keep a dish on my Bunsen burner, and the mixture will be inside. Over here you can see the iodine crystals have been labeled, and so you will have cool cotton over here on the sides, on the inverted funnel, on the sides of the inverted funnel, that are going to help the substance to sublime. So when the iodine crystals are going to sublime directly from solid to gas, when they're heated, what will happen? They will go up and they will condense over here with the help of the cool cotton wool that has lowered the temperature, so it will help them condense. This is how sublimation takes place. Next, I have simple distillation. Simple distillation is used when you want to separate a pure liquid from its solution. For example, I have salty water. Over here in the diagram below, I have salty water. So if I want to separate the water and the salt, I want to collect the water here. In simple distillation, you're going to collect the liquid, and in evaporation, you're going to collect the solid. So in salty water, if I want salt, so I'm going to evaporate the mixture till crystallization, because salt can form crystals. And if I want the water from the salty water, pure water, then I'm going to use simple distillation. So over here, what happens? You have your round bottom flask here. When you heat the mixture, the pure water vapors will rise at exactly 100 degrees Celsius, because that's the boiling point of water. And these vapors are going to pass through the Liebeck condenser. This is just the name of the condenser, the Liebeck condenser. And what does this condenser do? This has cool water going in from here and leaving from here. And in the middle, all those vapors that are passing through, they're going to condense because the temperature has been lowered. So these water vapors will condense and form a liquid, and are going to be collected in the beaker or whatever container you have at the bottom of the condenser. Now in your exam, they can ask you a question that, what is a mistake here? Is there any mistake in the apparatus? What are the kind of mistakes they can have? Over here, this arrow is for cooling water in. They can do the opposite. They can show that cooled water is leaving here, so that's wrong. Cool water will always enter from the bottom and leave from the top. So that's one error that you always need to have your eye out for in any fractional distillation or any distillation apparatus. Another one can be that there is no cork over here. What will happen? Those vapors will escape, so they won't, all of them won't pass through the Liebeck condenser. Then another mistake can be that the thermometer is touching the liquid. That's another mistake, because then it is going to be measuring the temperature of the liquid rather than the temperature of the water vapors, and we want the temperature of the water vapors. Another mistake they can set is that they can have this beaker or this container covered. So why is that going to be wrong? Because that can be buildup of pressure due to presence of water vapors inside the beaker. Okay. Now, then I have fractional distillation. So what's fractional distillation? It's for two miscible liquids. Fractional distillation will be taking place when I have two miscible liquids. What are miscible liquids? Liquids that mix together. So if my liquids, such as, if for example, I have water and alcohol, they both are going to dissolve in each other. They both are going to mix. So those are called miscible liquids. You need to know that the temperature, temperature for the boiling point of alcohol is 78 degrees Celsius, and for water it's 100 degrees Celsius. All of you must know that already. So when you are going to have a mixture of alcohol and water, and you want to separate them, and you want both substances, you want both of the pure forms of both the substances of alcohol and water, you're going to use fractional distillation. So what will happen, since alcohol has the lower boiling point, so it's going to form and evaporate in the form of vapors first at 78 degrees centigrade, and as soon as that 78 degrees centigrade, the temperature rises from that point, it becomes 78.1 degrees centigrade. As soon as it rises from that exact point, the vapors of alcohol are going to stop evaporating, and then the temperature will keep rising till we reach 100, where the vapors of water will be start evaporating. So you will collect the vapors for alcohol in a separate container and for water in a separate container. So here is my setup for fractional distillation. Over here, again, I have a round bottom flask. Here I have my mixture, 2 miscible liquids. And then I have this fractionating column, which is different from what I had in simple distillation. So what is this? The simple answer is, if you're asked that why is a fractionating column present, the simple answer is that it's used to separate the two mixtures completely, the two liquids completely. A fractionating column is used to separate the mixtures completely. Some of you might get confused if in your exam there are glass beads instead of these metal slabs kind of structures. In the fractionating column, it's the same thing, and they both are used to separate the mixtures completely. Now, what do I mean by that? In your exam, you will write that the fractionating column is separating the two liquids completely, but what actually happens is that if during the evaporation of alcohol at 78 degrees Celsius, it may be that some of the water vapors may start evaporating as well. Now, those will be half condensed vapors because the proper boiling point for water is 100 degrees Celsius. So these will be half condensed vapors. And so the fractionating column, they're going to condense once again on the fractionating column, and they're going to fall back into the liquid. That's why we use it. Again, we have the condenser here, water in from the bottom, water out from the top. We have this flask over here that has no cork over here. Once again, the thermometer does not touch the liquid, and there is a cork over here to prevent the escaping of your vapors. Now, paper chromatography, that's another technique that is very, very popular in your exams. So let's understand that very well. What is chromatography used for? When you want to separate a liquid into all its components. For example, I have a purple dye. Now, I know that purple dye is not a natural dye. So I'm going to use chromatography to see what dyes it's going to separate into. What are the natural dyes? The natural dyes are red and blue. So my purple ink spot or my purple sample is going to separate into red and blue. So then in paper chromatography, for example, I want to separate an amino salt, an amino acid into its mixtures. So amino acids are not visible. Over here, you can see that they're using colored dyes, which are clearly visible on your paper chromatogram. So if I want to separate my amino acid and that's not visible, it's a clear substance. So what am I going to do? I'm going to use a locating agent. And there are several examples of locating agents. You can use those locating agents. You can add that to the sample, and then your amino acid and its components are going to be visible to you. What solvent should be used in paper chromatography? You have this beaker, you have some mixture that is your solvent, and you dip your chromatogram or your chromatography paper into it. So what solvent should we use? We should use, the best solvent is ethanol. Why? Because ethanol is not going to mix with your sample. If it's water, it may be that the ink dissolves in your water, but there are more chances that if you use a substance like ethanol, so it's not going to dissolve in your with your sample. Okay, then what's the baseline? The baseline is the line on which I place my sample. So this is my chromatography paper. This is a line I've drawn with pencil. Why pencil? Because if it's ink, then that ink can mix with the sample, because ink is soluble in water, whereas lead is not soluble in water, and my pencil is made of lead. So that's why I will make my baseline with the pencil, and then I'm going to place my sample on it. And this baseline is not going to dissolve with my solvent. How do you calculate the RF value? RF value is the retention factor. So when I placed my chromatogram in my solvent, and the chromatogram is the final paper you get. For example, this is your chromatogram because the substance has separated. So when I place my chromatography paper with the sample on the baseline is going to touch the top of the liquid. And so my sample is going to separate into its components, because the solvent is going to travel upwards along with the sample, and the sample will slowly separate because this chromatograph paper is made up of a special substance. If I want to calculate the retention factor, now every separated substance has its own retention factor, which is how we can recognize them. So what is the retention factor? It's the distance traveled by that sample, by that component, divided by the distance traveled by the solvent. The RF value is always going to be less than 1. Now, why is that? Because just have a look at the formula. It says distance traveled by the component divided by distance traveled by the solvent. So the solvent is always going to travel the larger distance, and the component is always going to be left behind. And so the solvent front becomes the line, the point till which your solvent is traveling. And so when this is a greater value, for example, this becomes 2 centimeters, your solvent front reaches at 2 centimeters, your solvent travels 2 centimeters, and your component travels 1.5 centimeters. So over here, putting it in the formula, to travel by the component is 1.5 and traveled by the solvent is 2. So it's going to be less than 1, which is why my retention factor will always come less than 1 no matter what the substance. Here you have an example that you have these three samples, known samples, X, Y, and Z. You know what X, Y, and Z are, and you have this sample that you don't know what it contains of. So where is this important? Where is chromatography important? For example, you want to test a food dye, whether it contains the banned dyes or not. So there can be very few banned dyes, but a lot of allowed dyes. So we're going to take all the known banned dyes that we have, and we're going to put it with the sample, and we're going to separate all four. So for example, X, Y, and Z are the banned dyes, and the sample is the one that we don't know what it contains. So let's separate it. And over here, because sample X, Y, and Z were pure banned dyes, and our sample has separated into this purple colored substance and this green colored substance. Now both of the green colored substances have a matching distance, a matching color, so we know that the sample contains Y, which is a banned substance. The sample is not safe to consume because it contains a banned dye. And we can also calculate it through the RFs. So what is the RF for Y? It's the solvent front is at 6 centimeters, and Y has traveled 4 centimeters. We take the center of the substance, and over here is the center of the substance. It has also traveled 4 centimeters. So we're going to divide the substance, the distance traveled by the component with the distance traveled by the solvent. For both of them, it's coming out as 4/6, which becomes 2/3. That's the retention factor for Y and the substance in sample, which is Y as well. So that's how we can also identify that both of them are the same substances. Next, we have methods of analysis. How do I test the purity of any substance? How do I know if my substance is pure? How will I know that? There are three ways of knowing it. Firstly, it has an exact and fixed melting point. What do I mean by that? I told you that when you have an impurity added to any pure substance, the melting point decreases, and so does the boiling point, and you have a range of values for melting and boiling point. For example, if you add an impurity to water and the melting point was 0, it can now become 2, 3, -1, and so on. Okay, now I have 2, 3, -1, -2, which can be the changed values, but since we've discussed that when an impurity is added, the melting point always lowers. So 2 and 3 can't be because they're greater than 0. So there can be different range of values for the melting point of my water, and that can be -1, -2, -3 because I've added an impurity to it. I know that my substance is pure when it has one exact melting point, one exact boiling point, and it just shows one spot on the chromatogram. What do I mean by that? X, Y, and Z were pure, so they just showed one spot on the chromatogram. Whereas the sample was impure, it had several different dyes, so that is not a pure substance because it's dividing into 2 spots. So it does not remain pure. Now, we've understood how do I know if my substance is pure, exact melting point, fixed and exact boiling point, and just one spot on the chromatogram. Then the identification of ions, this is something that you need to memorize. This is if I want to test whether my solution contains aluminium 3+ ion, sodium hydroxide, it's going to form a white precipitate if I have aluminium in it. And when I add excess sodium hydroxide, which means a lot of sodium hydroxide, so I'm going to get a colorless solution. That confirms my test for aluminium. And to further confirm it, I'm going to add ammonia solution to that substance, and then it will form a white precipitate. And when I add it in excess, the white precipitate is going to remain. It's not going to become a clear solution like it did when I added excess sodium hydroxide. Now, why am I performing 4 kind of tests? First, little sodium hydroxide, then excess sodium hydroxide, then little ammonia, then excess ammonia, because some of the ions have the same results for some tests. And so which is why I need to perform it multiple times to confirm that it is the very ion I'm looking for. Now, then this is for anions. These are for anions, chloride ion, sulfate ion, carbonate ions. And again, they've given you what will happen. This is all that you have to memorize, and you can pause to read. So for chloride ion, if I want to check if there is the chloride ion in it, I'm going to add acidified silver nitrate, and it's going to form a white precipitate. The reaction for that is also given here. Right. Then the identification of gases. So how can I measure the speed of my chemical reaction? How? Because I'm going to use a gas syringe that's going to be connected to my apparatus. And so whatever is given off, whatever gas is given off, I'm going to collect it in my gas syringe. And there are different ways of finding out of collecting that gas. If I want to measure the speed of the chemical reaction and not just collect the gas, so I'm going to use the volume. I want to record the volume of the gas that is given off, and I can use the gas syringe for that. And I can also find the loss of mass, so I can place my whole apparatus on a beam balance or an electronic balance, and from the values I can know how much is lost. So how do I decide which method to collect my gas in? First, I will consider its density, then I will consider its solubility in water. If my gas is denser than air, what is the MR of air? MR is the relative molecular mass, and the MR of air is 29. So if the MR of the gas is larger than 29, then I'm going to use the downward delivery method, because then it's heavier than air. The gas can easily displace air, and so it's going to be collected at the bottom of the tube. This is how I'm going to, this is also known as downward displacement, upward displacement of air. Downward delivery of gas and upward displacement of air. Then if the gas is lighter, if it has an MR that is less than 29, what can I do? I can use the upward delivery method, or the downward of air. Air is being displaced downwards and the gas is being collected over here. But if I have an insoluble gas or a gas with very low solubility, for example, oxygen, then I can displace water for that. I can pass my gas through water and it's going to be collected at the top, because since it's not going to dissolve in water, it's going to be collected at the top. Since the water has a low density and the gas has a high density, so the gas is going to be collected at the top. Now, the test for gases. If I want to test whether hydrogen gas has been produced in my test tube, so I have a gas here produced here with this reaction, and the reaction was metal plus water, so probably hydrogen is produced. How can I test that hydrogen was produced? I can bring a lighted splint in near the gas, whatever gas it is, and if hydrogen is present, the fire will extinguish with a pop sound. Fire will extinguish with a pop sound. Then if I have oxygen, I'm going to bring a glowing splint near the gas, but the splint is still glowing and it's going to rekindle. You will now then see a flame when you bring it near the gas if oxygen is present. Then I have the test for carbon dioxide. So I have my gas formed in this test tube, and I'm going to use a tube to pass it into lime water. This is my lime water, CaOH. And that lime water is going to turn from clear to milky, which will be a positive test for carbon dioxide. Next, I have sulfur dioxide. For that, my potassium permanganate, I can use potassium permanganate, which turns from purple to colorless, or sodium dichromate 6. And that is going to turn from orange to green. Then I have chlorine. If I want to test the presence of chlorine, I'm going to bring a litmus paper near the gas. It's going to bleach the litmus paper. Any litmus paper, be it blue or red, but it preferably blue, because then what will happen? It will first turn red, then be bleached, as chlorine is going to turn the blue litmus red. If I want to test for ammonia, I'm going to bring a moist or damp red litmus near the gas, and it's going to turn blue. If the litmus is dry, it's not going to turn blue. Then test for water. We know what is anhydrous copper sulfate. It's pure dry white powder. Anhydrous copper sulfate is in the form of a dry white powder. If I add a liquid to it that I want to test if it's water or not, if it is water, there is a blue spot formed. What does that blue spot show? That now that copper sulfate has water of hydration and it becomes hydrated copper sulfate. So that tests that this is water. If there is no water, then there is nothing blue in your dish. Then, this is my first practice question. So what does the question say? Experimental design and methods of purification of analysis. That's a topic. Which of the following is a pure compound? Ethanol, petrol, steel, and tap water. Tap water is not pure. Many of you do put that in as an answer. Why is it not pure? Because your tap water contains different mineral ions, and so that is not pure. Steel is not pure. Steel is an alloy. All of us know that steel is an alloy. Petrol is not pure. It contains a mixture of hydrocarbons, so that makes it impure. The only pure substance I'm left with is ethanol. Then, the answer is A. I have the next question, which is on identification of ions and gases. The results of tests carried out on compound X are shown. The test is that when dilute hydrochloric acid was added, a gas was given off which turns lime water cloudy. Remember, we did this test right now, and lime water turns cloudy or white precipitate forms, or it turns milky when you have carbon dioxide. And it was warmed with aqueous sodium hydroxide, a gas evolved which turned the red litmus blue. So We did that. That's ammonia gas. We just did that as the last test for gases. What is compound X? Calcium nitrate? No. There is no calcium nor nitrate in these two substances. Calcium carbonate? No. Ammonium nitrate? No. Ammonium carbonate? Yes. Why? Because I have ammonium over here, ammonia, and with carbon dioxide, it's going to form ammonium carbonate. So what's my answer? A again. Then I have a question on experimental design and methods of purification. A paper chromatography experiment is carried out to separate and identify the mixture of amino acids produced from the hydrolysis of a protein. We just discussed there's an amino acid here. Amino acids are not visible. We need a locating agent. It's here. We need a chromatography paper, obviously, because we need to perform chromatography and paper chromatography. And then what else do we need? Can we use a marker pen? No, because we discussed that that ink is going to dissolve in the solvent. We can use a pencil. Yes. Do we need a ruler for the baseline? Yes. Do we need a solvent? Yes. Do we need a thermometer? No. Why do we need a thermometer? We don't need to measure the temperature in chromatography. So the answer is B. Now, then I have a question on identification of ions and gases. Which row correctly gives the tests to identify both ammonia and sulfur dioxide? For ammonia, we know that the damp red litmus paper is going to turn blue. And for sulfur dioxide, we know we're going to use acidified potassium magnate 7. That is going to turn from orange to green. Okay, the answer is C, yes. Then we have a question on experimental design methods of purification and analysis. A chemist wishes to separate and identify a mixture of substances using paper chromatography. The diagram shows the apparatus used. The solvent is water. The solvent front is allowed to reach the top of the paper. You must have seen in all the examples, my solvent front was still here. It did not reach the end of the paper. What is the problem if it reaches the end of the paper? I don't know how much distance it traveled. It could have reached the end of the paper, and then the water could have traveled more distance if I had a larger paper, a longer paper. Since I don't know the exact distance, I cannot calculate the RF value. So it makes it impossible to calculate the RF values, and the correct answer is B. Then I have a question on purification, methods of purification. Substance X melts at 53 degrees Celsius and boils at 100 degrees Celsius. This is not water because water has a melting point of 0 degrees Celsius, not 53. It does not dissolve in water. It's insoluble, okay? And it does not react with water. It's unreactive with water. Which diagram shows the most suitable method of separating X from a mixture of X and water? Since it's insoluble and it has a boiling point similar to water, when the two of them have the same boiling point, they're going to evaporate at the same time. I can't separate it using distillation. And why can I not use evaporation? Because it is not dissolving in water, right? So I can't even use the evaporation of the mixture. The only method left is that I filter the mixture, and so the filtrate collected would be water and the residue collected would be X. The answer is C. I have hexane 70 degrees Celsius and heptane 98 degrees Celsius. What is the correct graph for the fractional distillation of the two miscible liquids? Well, first 70 degrees comes first. So first it's going to evaporate at 70 degrees Celsius, the vapors, then the temperature is going to rise till 98 degrees Celsius. So my graph should be like this. A is the correct answer. Then I have another question on chromatography. We know that chromatography is a topic that is very popular in our exams. The diagram shows the chromatogram of 4 different sugars using the same solvent. Glucose has an RF of 0.5. Which sugar is glucose? It's very clear. The distance traveled 0.5 is by C. Why? Because C has, for example, traveled the distance of 1. It's crossed half. And the solvent front has traveled a distance of 2. It becomes 0.5. Let's check for the others as well. If the solvent front had a distance of 2, by I, we can tell that this has traveled a distance of 1. This has traveled a distance of nearly 2. So 2 upon 2 becomes a little less than 1. So that can't be 0.5. D is wrong. B has hardly traveled any distance, around 0.1. So 0.1 upon 2 doesn't make 0.5. This is wrong. This has also traveled a little distance like 0.5. So 0.5 upon 2 doesn't make 0.5. And so A is also wrong. The only correct answer is C. Now I have another last question. They're asking you, how are they going to measure the gas? What is going to be at X? We've discussed how do we collect the gas? We use a gas syringe. The answer is B. Thank you for attending. Please check out our other videos on chemistry, biology, maths, physics, add maths, Urdu, and do like and subscribe.